May 19, 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a pale morning sky. Commander Shinobu Endo stands on the conning tower of submarine RO-106, salt spray stinging his face. His boat moves slowly through waters near the Mariana Islands, part of a picket line ordered to detect the approaching American fleet. Through his binoculars, he sweeps the horizon. Then he sees them. Not one carrier, not two. 8 escort carriers steaming in formation, aircraft circling above like hunting birds. His executive officer climbs up beside him, counts silently, and turns with eyes that betray something close to despair. They had been briefed on American strength, but briefings are words on paper. This is different. This is real. The numbers are impossible. In his years of service, Endo had never imagined such a sight. He realizes, in that cold moment of recognition, that Japan cannot win this war. The war had turned. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a reality it could no longer deny. The victories of 1941 and 1942 had evaporated into memories, replaced by a grinding retreat across the Central Pacific. American forces had seized the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Tarawa had cost the Marines dearly, but they had taken it. The Marshall Islands fell in February 1944. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, islands that Japanese strategists had considered impregnable, collapsed within days under the weight of American naval gunfire and carrier aviation. The defensive perimeter Japan had fought so desperately to create was crumbling, island by island, atoll by atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the Central Pacific offensive with methodical precision. His island-hopping strategy bypassed heavily fortified positions, leaving them isolated and irrelevant, while American forces seized locations of strategic value. Each captured island brought American air power closer to the Japanese homeland. Each victory demonstrated the overwhelming material superiority the United States now wielded. The Japanese Navy, which had once boasted 10 fleet carriers, now struggled to maintain 4 operational carriers with trained pilots. At Midway, in June 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. The loss of experienced aviators proved even more catastrophic than the loss of ships. Japan's rigid training system could not replace skilled carrier pilots at the rate America could. The submarine arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with high expectations. Japan possessed some of the finest submarines in the world. The I-class boats were large, long-ranged, and heavily armed. Many carried float planes for reconnaissance. The RO-class boats, smaller and more numerous, were designed for coastal operations and defensive patrols. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacking enemy warships, particularly aircraft carriers and battleships. The Navy viewed submarines as fleet weapons, scouts, and ambush predators meant to weaken enemy battle lines before the decisive surface engagement. This doctrine reflected Japan's adherence to the concept of kantai-kessen, the decisive battle that would shatter enemy resolve and force a negotiated peace. But by 1944, that doctrine had proven disastrously flawed. While American submarines hunted Japanese merchant shipping with ruthless efficiency, strangling Japan's supply lines and starving its war industries of raw materials, Japanese submarines wasted their potential stalking heavily defended warships. American destroyers and destroyer escorts surrounded carriers with layers of screening vessels equipped with sonar and depth charges. Breaking through such defenses required luck, skill, and often suicidal courage. Even when Japanese submarines succeeded in hitting American warships, the losses rarely proved decisive. Meanwhile, Japan's merchant marine hemorrhaged tonnage. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies, cargo ships carrying rubber, rice, and bauxite, troop transports shuttling soldiers between garrisons, all fell victim to American submarines. By 1944, Japan's shipping losses exceeded its capacity to replace vessels. The home islands faced shortages of food, fuel, and industrial materials. Japanese submarine losses mounted steadily. American anti-submarine warfare improved with terrifying speed. Early in the war, Japanese submarines operated with relative impunity, sinking carriers Wasp and Yorktown, damaging battleship North Carolina and carrier Saratoga. But by 1943, American forces had learned. Escort carriers began accompanying convoys and amphibious task forces. These small carriers, derided by some as jeep carriers or baby flattops, carried anti-submarine aircraft equipped with radar, magnetic anomaly detectors, and depth bombs. Destroyers received improved sonar and new weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that eliminated the need to pass directly over a target before attacking. Japanese submarines, which lacked radar warning receivers until very late in the war, found themselves hunted by enemies they could not detect until too late. The Imperial Navy's leadership remained fixated on surface battles and carrier operations. Resources that might have gone to anti-submarine warfare or protecting merchant shipping instead went to building battleships like Yamato and Musashi, magnificent vessels that spent most of the war anchored in harbors to conserve fuel. Japan's failure to prioritize convoy protection proved catastrophic. American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping during the war, approximately 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. They also sank 1 battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. Japanese submarines, by contrast, sank fewer than 200,000 tons of merchant shipping despite possessing comparable or superior technology at the war's start. While Japan's submarine force withered, America's industrial capacity reached full mobilization. The United States possessed advantages Japan could never match: vast natural resources, a massive industrial base, and a population that dwarfed Japan's. In 1944, those advantages translated into production numbers that defied comprehension. American shipyards launched vessels at a pace unprecedented in naval history. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship before the war, revolutionized naval construction with mass production techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. His shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, and Richmond, California, became assembly lines for escort carriers. The Casablanca-class escort carrier represented a triumph of practical engineering over traditional naval architecture. Kaiser's designers took a maritime commission tanker hull and transformed it into an aircraft carrier. The resulting vessel displaced just over 10,000 tons fully loaded, measured 512 feet in overall length, and carried a flight deck 477 feet long. Powered by 2 reciprocating steam engines, Casablanca-class carriers achieved a top speed of 19 knots, slower than fleet carriers but adequate for convoy escort and amphibious support. Each carried 28 aircraft, typically 12 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 16 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. The Avengers, equipped with radar and depth charges, proved devastatingly effective anti-submarine. Weapons Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard began construction of the lead ship, Casablanca, in November 1942. The Aituya vessel was launched on April 5, 1943. Between that date and July 8, 1944, Kaiser's yards completed all 50 ships of the class, 50 escort carriers in 15 months, nearly 1 per week. Each carrier took approximately 3 months to build from keel laying to launch. The speed of construction shocked even American naval officers. Traditional fleet carriers of the Essex class required approximately 20 months to complete. Kaiser proved that applying industrial mass production principles to shipbuilding could compress construction schedules dramatically. Standardized components, prefabrication, and assembly line techniques transformed naval construction. The Casablanca class supplemented earlier escort carriers. The Bogue class, built on cargo ship hulls, had entered service in 1942 and 1943. The Sangamon class, converted from fleet oilers, provided valuable service despite being built in small numbers. By mid-1944, the United States Navy operated over 70 escort carriers, with more entering service monthly. These vessels served in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. In the Atlantic, they formed hunter-killer groups that devastated German U-boat operations. In the Pacific, they provided air cover for amphibious invasions, served as aircraft transports, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and supported fleet operations. Japanese naval intelligence tracked American carrier construction as best they could. Reports reached Tokyo detailing new Essex-class fleet carriers joining the Pacific Fleet. Intelligence officers compiled estimates of American industrial capacity, but the sheer scale of American production exceeded Japanese comprehension. Japan's entire wartime carrier construction program produced 17 fleet and light carriers. America completed 17 Essex-class fleet carriers alone, plus 11 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, plus 77 escort carriers. The numerical disparity represented more than industrial capacity. It reflected fundamentally different national resources and priorities. Japan struggled to maintain 4 operational fleet carriers by mid-1944. Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, remained in service but faced critical shortages of trained pilots and aircraft. Newly built carriers Taiho, Hio, and Junyo joined the fleet, but lacked experienced air groups. Japan's carrier aviation had never recovered from losses at Midway. The Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea. Pilot training programs that had once required years of rigorous preparation now graduated aviators after months of abbreviated instruction. Quality suffered catastrophically. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs expanded massively, producing thousands of well-trained aviators who benefited from combat veterans rotating home to serve as instructors. The escort carriers embodied American advantages. They were cheap, mass-produced, and good enough. They lacked the speed, armor, and aircraft capacity of fleet carriers, but they fulfilled essential roles fleet carriers could not. A fleet carrier was far too valuable to risk on convoy escort or anti-submarine patrol. An escort carrier cost a fraction of a fleet carrier's price and could be built in a fraction of the time. If sunk, it could be replaced quickly. This pragmatic approach to naval construction reflected American industrial philosophy. Build adequate numbers of good enough equipment rather than small numbers of perfect equipment. For Japanese submarine commanders, the proliferation of escort carriers represented a nightmare scenario. Early in the war, submarines had operated in vast expanses of ocean where detection was unlikely. By 1944, American escort carriers covered invasion fleets, convoy routes, and strategic choke points. Their aircraft patrolled day and night, equipped with radar that could detect a submarine's periscope or conning tower from miles away. Surfaced submarines, which needed to run their diesel engines to recharge batteries, faced almost certain detection if aircraft were nearby. Submerged submarines ran on limited battery power and moved slowly. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare had shifted decisively in favor of the hunters. Henry Kaiser understood manufacturing in ways traditional shipbuilders did not. He had built dams, highways, and industrial facilities. When the government approached him about building cargo ships, he applied mass production principles that revolutionized the industry. Liberty ships, the standard cargo vessels that sustained Allied logistics, initially took nearly 250 days to complete. Kaiser's yards reduced that to an average of 42 days by 1943. His Vancouver yard set a record by completing one Liberty ship in just 4 days and 15 hours, a publicity stunt that demonstrated the potential of prefabrication and assembly line techniques. Escort carriers presented different challenges than cargo ships. They required flight decks, hangar decks, aviation fuel systems, and catapults. Kaiser's engineers designed modular sections built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard. Flight deck sections, hull sections, and superstructure elements came together like puzzle pieces. Welding replaced riveting wherever possible, speeding construction. Workers labored around the clock in 3 shifts. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working as welders, electricians, and fitters. The workforce at Kaiser's yards exceeded 15,000 at peak production. Quality control remained stringent despite rapid construction. Every carrier underwent sea trials and inspections before commissioning. The economic implications were staggering. Each Casablanca-class carrier cost approximately $6 million. An Essex-class fleet carrier cost roughly $70 million. For the price of one fleet carrier, America could build nearly 12 escort carriers. The strategic flexibility this provided proved invaluable. Escort carriers could be everywhere the Navy needed air cover without risking irreplaceable fleet carriers. When escort carriers were sunk, and several were, the losses hurt but did not cripple fleet operations. Japan, by contrast, could not afford to lose any carriers. Each loss diminished an already inadequate force. The hunter-killer group concept emerged from American anti-submarine warfare experiences in the Atlantic. A typical group centered on one escort carrier accompanied by 4 to 6 destroyer escorts. The carrier provided organic air cover and anti-submarine aircraft. Destroyer escorts screened the carrier and prosecuted sonar contacts. This combination proved lethal to submarines. Aircraft searched vast areas rapidly, using radar to detect surfaced submarines or periscope wakes. When aircraft detected a submarine, they marked its position with smoke floats and attacked with depth charges or acoustic homing torpedoes. Destroyer escorts rushed to the location and conducted sonar searches. If the submarine survived the air attack and remained submerged, destroyers pinned it down with sonar and attacked with depth charges or hedgehog salvos. Submarines had few effective counters to this coordinated approach. Remaining submerged meant limited mobility and battery depletion. Eventually, the submarine would need to surface or risk suffocation. Surfacing during daylight with aircraft overhead meant almost certain destruction. Running on the surface at night offered the only realistic escape option, but even darkness provided limited protection against radar-equipped aircraft. Japanese submarines lacked effective radar warning receivers until very late in the war. They did not know they had been detected until bombs fell or depth charges exploded. In the Pacific, hunter-killer groups adapted to different operational requirements than Atlantic groups faced. Pacific groups often supported amphibious operations, screening invasion fleets against submarine attack. They also conducted offensive patrols in areas where Japanese submarines were expected. Ultra-intelligence, derived from decrypted Japanese naval communications, provided invaluable information about submarine deployments. American commanders knew where Japanese submarines were supposed to be, what their orders were, and what picket lines they established. This intelligence enabled hunter-killer groups to ambush submarines with devastating effectiveness. Two technologies transformed anti-submarine warfare: radar and the hedgehog. Radar allowed detection of submarines at ranges and in conditions impossible for visual spotting. Early radar sets were large and ship-mounted, but by 1943, American factories produced compact radar sets light enough for installation in carrier-based aircraft. The ASV radar used by Navy Avengers could detect a surfaced submarine from 10 miles away. Later versions could detect periscopes. Radar removed the submarine's greatest defensive advantage: concealment in vast ocean expanses. The Hedgehog represented a revolutionary approach to depth charge attack. Traditional depth charges required a ship to pass directly over a submarine's estimated position before rolling charges off the stern. This method meant the attacking ship lost sonar contact during the final approach, essentially attacking blind. Depth charges also detonated at preset depths, whether they hit anything or not, alerting the submarine to the attack and allowing evasive action. The Hedgehog solved both problems. Mounted on the bow, it launched 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the ship. The launching ship maintained sonar contact throughout the attack. Projectiles only exploded on contact with the submarine, so if no explosion occurred, the attacking ship knew it had missed and could adjust aim for another attack. A hedgehog explosion meant a hit, and a hit usually meant a kill. Japanese submarines had no equivalent technologies. They lacked effective radar until very late in the war, and even then availability remained limited. Their radar warning receivers, introduced in mid-1944, could only alert submarines they had been detected. Japanese torpedoes, particularly the oxygen-fueled Type 95, were excellent weapons, but they could not compensate for the inability to detect and evade enemy hunters. Technology alone did not determine outcomes, but it shifted probabilities significantly in favor of American forces. For Japanese submarine crews, 1944 meant constant fear. Every patrol carried the likelihood of death. Submarines departed on missions knowing many would not return. Crew morale, once sustained by early war successes and belief in ultimate victory, eroded as losses mounted. Veterans who had survived multiple patrols knew the odds were turning against them. New submariners, rushed through abbreviated training, lacked the skills and experience that might have kept them alive. Life aboard a Japanese submarine combined extreme discomfort with mortal danger. I-class boats measured over 300 feet long, but housed crews of 90 to 100 men. Space was precious. Bunks were scarce. Off-duty crews slept wherever space existed, among torpedoes, beside machinery, in passageways. The air inside a submerged submarine grew foul within hours, thick with carbon dioxide, humidity, and the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and battery acid. Food deteriorated quickly in tropical heat. Fresh provisions lasted days. After that, crews subsisted on rice, pickled vegetables, and canned fish. Potable water was rationed strictly. Combat added terror to discomfort. Depth charge attacks meant hours of silent running, while explosions shook the hull. Each detonation felt like a hammer blow. Close explosions shattered light bulbs, cracked gauges, and sprung leaks. Crew members stood at their stations in darkness, broken only by emergency lighting, waiting for the hull to rupture, for water to burst through failing seals, for death by drowning or crushing pressure. Those who survived attacks returned to base exhausted, traumatized, and aware they would soon face the same ordeal again. In May 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared Operation A-Go, a plan to destroy the American fleet in a decisive battle. Intelligence suggested American forces would strike at the Mariana Islands. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, ordered the establishment of submarine picket lines to provide early warning of American movements and to attrite enemy forces before the main fleet engagement. 3 picket lines were designated NA, NI, and SAI. The NA line stretched from the Caroline Islands toward the Marianas, positioned to intercept American task forces approaching from the east. 7. Submarines of Submarine Squadron 7 deployed to the NA line on May 15, 1944. They were RO-class boats, RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, Arrow, Sant-08, Arrow, Sant-16, Arrow, Sant-17, and I-16. Each submarine took station along the picket line at intervals of approximately 50 to 60 miles. Their orders were to report American fleet movements and attack targets of opportunity. The submarines maintained radio silence unless detecting enemy forces. They were to remain on station until ordered to withdraw or until American forces passed through. American signals intelligence intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications detailing the picket line deployment. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, knew exactly where Japanese submarines would be positioned and when they would arrive. He ordered hunter-killer groups to intercept and destroy the picket line before the main invasion force moved into the area. 3 destroyer escorts, England, George, and Raby, accompanied by the destroyer Spangler and under the tactical control of Commander Hamilton Haynes, received orders to sweep the NA line. The operational plan was methodical. American forces would approach each submarine's projected position, conduct sonar and air searches, and destroy any contacts. Ultra-intelligence reduced the search problem from finding needles in oceanic haystacks to checking specific map coordinates. The Japanese submarine crews, unaware their positions had been compromised, remained on station as ordered, waiting to detect an American fleet that was instead hunting them. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's submarine force could not sustain heavy losses. Unlike American submarine construction, which continued throughout the war, Japan's submarine building program slowed dramatically after 1942 as resources shifted to destroyers and escort vessels. Each submarine lost represented a permanent reduction in capability. The submariners themselves were equally irreplaceable. Training new submarine crews required months even under accelerated programs. Experienced commanders were scarce and valuable. Losing entire picket lines meant not just losing boats, but losing institutional knowledge and tactical expertise. Numbers break minds as surely as explosions break hulls. When Commander Endo saw 8 escort carriers steaming in formation, he faced a psychological crisis as much as a tactical one. Japanese intelligence had briefed submarine commanders about increasing American carrier strength, but intelligence reports remained abstract. Seeing the reality was different. 8 carriers meant hundreds of aircraft. It meant continuous air patrols, overlapping search patterns, and saturation coverage that made submarine operations suicidal. It meant America possessed so many carriers, it could deploy them in task groups for secondary missions while fleet carriers conducted primary operations elsewhere. The psychological weight of numerical inferiority crushed morale across the Japanese submarine force. Veterans remembered when Japanese carriers dominated the Pacific, when 4 carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, when Kido Butai had swept through the Indian Ocean sinking British carriers and cruisers. By 1944, that era felt like ancient history. Now American carriers appeared in overwhelming numbers. Aviators flew from dozens of decks. Production replaced losses faster than Japanese submarines could inflict them. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with greater reserves, and Japan's reserves were exhausted. Some commanders broke under the strain. Reports from surviving crew members after the war described captains who became increasingly erratic, making irrational decisions, freezing during attacks, or taking reckless chances born from desperation rather than tactical calculation. Other commanders maintained discipline and professionalism even as hope faded, leading their crews with quiet courage, knowing they were fighting a losing battle. Suicide missions became more common as the war progressed. Submarines were ordered to beach themselves on enemy-held islands to deliver supplies, missions that offered minimal chance of return. Others received orders to attack heavily defended targets in shallow waters, where maneuverability was limited and escape unlikely. For submariners who survived the war, the memory of counting enemy carriers haunted them. Some wrote memoirs after Japan's surrender, describing the sinking realization that their nation could not win. They remembered specific moments when the truth became undeniable. Seeing too many enemy ships, counting too many aircraft, realizing their own side had nothing comparable to deploy. These moments of recognition were deeply personal. They represented the shattering of national mythology and military confidence. Japan had begun the war believing in racial superiority, spiritual strength, and tactical excellence. By 1944, those beliefs collided with industrial reality. Spirit could not sink escort carriers. Tactical excellence meant nothing when outnumbered 10-1. The breaking point was not a single battle, but an accumulation of overwhelming evidence that victory was impossible. The fear extended beyond death. Japanese military culture emphasized honor, duty, and sacrifice. Submariners accepted the possibility of death in combat. What they could not accept was futility. Dying in a mission that advanced strategic objectives was honorable. Dying in missions that accomplished nothing that changed nothing, that merely delayed inevitable defeat, that was harder to endure. By late 1944, many submarine missions felt exactly that: futile. Submarines deployed knowing they would not return, knowing their deaths would not alter the war's outcome, but deploying anyway because orders demanded it and culture required it. May 19, 1944. The destroyer escort USS England, designated DE-635, steamed through Pacific waters as part of Commander Haynes's hunter-killer group. England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, smaller and less heavily armed than fleet destroyers, but specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. She displaced 1,400 tons, measured 306 feet long, and carried a crew of 15 officers and 200 enlisted men. Her primary anti-submarine weapons were depth charge racks, K-gun depth charge projectors, and a forward-mounted hedgehog. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, had trained his crew relentlessly in anti-submarine tactics. At 1:15 in the morning, England's sonar operator reported a contact at approximately 1,400 yards. The trace was solid, consistent with a submerged submarine. Pendleton ordered battle stations. The crew scrambled to their positions. Sonar tracked the contact as England maneuvered for attack. At 1:35, Pendleton ordered Hedgehog launch. 24 projectiles arced through darkness and splashed into the ocean ahead of the ship. Seconds passed. Then explosions erupted underwater, multiple detonations indicating direct hits. The submarine RO-106, Commander Endo's boat, shattered under the impacts. High-pressure water flooded compartments instantly. The hull collapsed under crushing depth. All hands were lost. England had drawn first blood. The hunter-killer group continued sweeping the NA line. On May 22nd, 3 days after sinking RO-106, England's sonar detected another contact. Again, Pendleton maneuvered for attack. Again, Hedgehog projectiles found their target. RO-104 exploded and sank, taking her crew of 54 to the bottom. 2 submarines in 3 days. England's crew began to believe they possessed an edge, a combination of skill and luck that made them particularly lethal. They did not know that ultra-intelligence guided their search, but they knew their sonar operators were exceptionally skilled, and their Hedgehog attacks were devastatingly accurate. May 23rd. Less than 24 hours after sinking RO-104, England detected a third submarine. This time, multiple ships of the hunter-killer group converged on the contact. England maneuvered into attack position. Her Hedgehog fired. Explosions followed. RO-116 joined her sister boats on the ocean floor. 3 submarines in 5 days. Commander Haynes reported the successes to higher command. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, received the reports with satisfaction. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor noted the efficiency of the hunter-killer operations. The NA line was being systematically destroyed. May 26th, England's sonar operators were exhausted, but maintained sharp focus. They had become hunters in the purest sense, predators seeking prey with single-minded intensity. Another contact appeared. Pendleton ordered the now familiar approach. Hedgehog launched. The ocean erupted with explosions. RO-108 died before her crew understood what had happened. 4 submarines in 8 days. England's name was becoming legendary within the Navy. Admiral King sent a message. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. The pun reflected genuine admiration. By Breber 30, the hunter-killer group approached. The position where intelligence indicated another submarine should be stationed. Sonar conditions were difficult. Temperature layers in the water created false echoes and masked real contacts. For hours, the ships searched without result. Then, late in the afternoon, England's sonar operator reported a solid contact. Pendleton took his ship into attack position. The Hedgehog fired. Explosions followed. RO-105 became the 5th victim in 11 days. The crew's confidence had transformed into quiet certainty. They were the best anti-submarine vessel in the Pacific, possibly in the entire Navy. May 31st. Commander Haynes received intelligence about one more submarine, I-16, positioned at the end of the NA line. The hunter-killer group raced to intercept. England took point position. Her sonar swept the suspected area methodically. Contact. This time, the submarine commander had detected the hunters and was attempting to evade. I-16 maneuvered frantically, changing course and depth, trying to shake the sonar lock. England's operators held contact through the evasions. Pendleton ordered the approach. Hedgehog launched. The projectiles arced perfectly. Explosions thundered underwater. I-16, a large I-class boat carrying a crew of 90, broke apart and sank. 6 submarines in 12 days. No ship in the history of naval warfare had ever achieved such a record. The destruction of the NA line had strategic consequences beyond the immediate losses. Operation Ago's early warning system had been blinded. When American carrier task forces approached the Marianas in June, no submarine picket line provided warning. Japanese fleet commanders received no advance notice of American strength or dispositions. The element of surprise, which Japan desperately needed, was lost. Admiral Toyota launched his carriers into battle without accurate intelligence about enemy forces. The resulting Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. American fighters shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The defeat was catastrophic. October 25, 1944. The war had moved to the Philippines. American forces invaded Leyte Island, establishing a foothold in the central Philippines. The Japanese Navy committed its remaining strength to a desperate counterattack known as Operation Shogo. 4 separate Japanese task forces converged on Leyte Gulf, intending to destroy American invasion shipping. The plan was complex and relied on coordination between forces separated by hundreds of miles. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the most powerful of the Japanese formations. His fleet included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 2 smaller battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Admiral William Halsey commanded the American Third Fleet, which included the fast carrier task forces that provided air cover for the invasion. On October 24th, American carrier aircraft struck Kurita's center force as it transited the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of bombers attacked the Japanese ships. Musashi, the largest battleship ever built, absorbed torpedo and bomb hit after torpedo and bomb hit. She finally capsized and sank in late afternoon, taking over half her crew with her. The attacks forced Kurita to temporarily reverse course. American pilots reported the Japanese were retreating. Halsey believed the center force had been neutralized as an effective threat. That night, Japanese carriers approaching from the north were detected. Halsey faced a decision. The carriers represented the remnants of Japan's once mighty carrier force. Destroying them would eliminate Japanese carrier aviation permanently. But Halsey also had responsibility for protecting the Leyte invasion beaches. He made his choice. He took the entire Third Fleet north to engage the Japanese carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. During the night, Kurita reversed course again and passed through the strait, emerging into the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's battleships and cruisers encountered Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, a small force of escort carriers conducting routine air support operations. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts screened them. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded the unit. When lookouts reported pagoda masts on the horizon, Sprague initially thought they were part of Halsey's force. Then shells began falling. They were Japanese battleship shells, massive projectiles that created enormous splashes towering higher than a ship's mast. Sprague realized with horror that his small force faced the most powerful surface fleet Japan had put to sea in months. The escort carriers were not designed for surface combat. They were slow, thin-skinned, and carried no guns larger than 5 inches. The carriers immediately turned east and fled at maximum speed, making smoke to obscure Japanese gunfire. Sprague launched every aircraft available. Avengers and Wildcats took off carrying whatever ordnance could be loaded quickly. Anti-submarine depth charges, fragmentation bombs, machine gun ammunition. Some aircraft launched with empty bomb bays, intending to make dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners. Every minute the carriers stayed afloat was a minute more aircraft could attack. The destroyers and destroyer escorts charged the Japanese fleet. It was a suicidal gesture, but necessary. The destroyers, Johnston, Hole, and Heermann, along with destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, made high-speed torpedo runs against battleships and cruisers. They were David attacking Goliath. Johnston closed to within 10,000 yards of battleship Congo before launching torpedoes, then turned and engaged cruisers with her 5-inch guns. Japanese shells smashed into her superstructure, killing her captain and most of the bridge crew. She fought until enemy fire silenced every gun and torpedo mount, then sank with colors still flying. Hoel launched torpedoes at battleship Yamato, forcing the giant to turn away. Heavy cruiser fire gutted Hole. She capsized and sank. Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname Destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship for engaging Japanese cruisers at point-blank range until overwhelmed by enemy fire. The carriers continued fleeing. Gambier Bay took multiple hits from Japanese cruisers. Her flight deck erupted in flames. She lost power and slowed. Japanese cruisers closed and pounded her with 8-inch shells. She capsized and sank at 9:07 a.m., the only American carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. St. Lo, Kalinin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay all took hits, but remained afloat. Aircraft from all 3 Taffy groups, plus aircraft diverted from other missions, swarmed the Japanese fleet. They made run after run, dropping whatever ordnance they carried, then making dry runs when ordnance was exhausted. Then, inexplicably, the Japanese withdrew. At approximately 9:20 a.m., just when it seemed the remaining carriers would be overwhelmed, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off and retire north. His reasons remained debated for decades after the war. He had been under continuous air attack for hours. His flagship had lost communications with several ships. He believed he faced fleet carriers, not escorts. He feared being trapped by Halsey's returning carriers. Whatever his reasoning, he withdrew, allowing the surviving escort carriers to escape. Taffy 3 had been saved by the sacrifice of its destroyers and the courage of its aviators. The battle off Samar demonstrated what escort carriers could endure. They were not designed for fleet actions. They were slow, lightly armed, and vulnerable. But they had survived an encounter with battleships through sheer determination, the bravery of their escort vessels, and the effectiveness of their aircraft. After the battle, the significance of America's escort carrier force became undeniable. They were everywhere. They supported invasions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They hunted submarines. They transported aircraft. They provided fleet logistics support. By war's end, over 70 escort carriers served in the Pacific alone. For Japanese naval officers who survived the war, the memory of endless American carriers represented the final proof of industrial defeat. They had sunk some. Liscombe Bay torpedoed in 1943. Amane Bay hit by kamikaze in 1945. St. Lo sunk by kamikaze at Leyte Gulf. Bismarck Sea sunk by kamikaze at Iwo Jima. But for every escort carrier sunk, 2 more appeared. The numbers never diminished. American production exceeded Japanese destruction rates by orders of magnitude. The war of attrition was lost before it truly began. The numbers told a story of systematic destruction. Between May and June 1944, during the period surrounding Operation Ago and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, approximately 17 of the 25 Japanese submarines deployed to the Marianas area were sunk. The NA picket line ceased to exist. Other picket lines fared little better. American hunter-killer groups prowled the Central Pacific with lethal efficiency. Guided by ultra-intelligence and equipped with technology Japanese submarines could not counter. By the end of 1944, Japan's submarine force had been reduced to approximately 40 operational boats, from a wartime peak of over 100. Losses exceeded 60%. The human cost was catastrophic. Japanese submarines operated with crews ranging from 50 to 100 men depending on vessel size. When a submarine sank, the entire crew usually died. There were no survivors from most sinkings. Depth charge and hedgehog attacks killed instantly, or trapped crews in sinking hulls where they drowned or suffocated. Approximately 10,000 Japanese submariners died during the war, a staggering loss rate exceeding 75%. For comparison, American submarine forces, which aggressively prosecuted offensive operations throughout the war, suffered approximately 22% losses. The difference reflected not courage, but technology, doctrine, and industrial support. USS England's 12-day rampage became legendary, but was not unique. Other destroyer escorts and hunter-killer groups achieved significant successes. USS Bory rammed and sank U-405 in the Atlantic. USS Buckley sank U-66. CVE-based hunter-killer groups in the Atlantic sank 24 U-boats by the end of 1943. In the Pacific, escort carriers directly participated in sinking numerous submarines through their aircraft or as flagships for destroyer escort groups. The combination of escort carrier aviation and destroyer escort anti-submarine weapons proved overwhelmingly effective. Japan's merchant marine suffered devastation that dwarfed submarine losses. American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, approximately 60% of the entire merchant fleet. By late 1944, oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had nearly ceased. Japan's strategic oil reserves were exhausted. The Navy reduced training operations to conserve fuel. Battleships remained in port. Aircraft sat idle. Industrial production declined as raw material shortages worsened. Aluminum for aircraft frames became scarce. Steel production fell. Food imports dropped, causing rationing to worsen. The home islands faced potential starvation. The combined fleet ceased to be a coherent fighting force. After the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan possessed no effective carrier force. The remaining battleships had insufficient fuel for operations. Cruisers and destroyers faced critical shortages of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Submarines could not effectively interdict American supply lines because they were themselves being hunted to extinction. Kamikazes represented Japan's final desperate tactical innovation, using aircraft and pilots as guided missiles since conventional attacks proved ineffective. Kamikaze attacks damaged and sank dozens of American ships, but could not alter strategic outcomes. America built ships faster than kamikazes could sink them. American industrial production reached its peak in 1944. Factories delivered over 96,000 aircraft that year. Shipyards launched escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, landing craft, cargo ships, and tankers in quantities that exceeded the combined production of all Axis nations. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the United States Navy possessed over 6,000 vessels of all types. This included 28 fleet carriers, 71 escort carriers, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, hundreds of destroyers and destroyer escorts, and dozens of submarines. Japan could not match such numbers. No nation could. The strategic bombing campaign that began in late 1944 after American forces captured the Marianas added another layer of destruction. B-29 superfortresses flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam struck Japanese industrial targets and cities. The bombing destroyed factories, killed workers, and burned urban areas to ash. The combination of submarine blockade, surface fleet actions, air superiority, and strategic bombing created interlocking systems of destruction that crushed Japan's ability to wage war. By spring 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. The Japanese submarine force attempted to adapt but lacked resources and time. Radar warning receivers were finally installed on submarines in mid-1944, but by then, most experienced crews were dead. New commanders lacked tactical skills to effectively use the limited technology available. Submarines received orders to focus on merchant shipping rather than warships, a belated recognition of doctrine that should have been implemented in 1941, but the change came too late. American anti-submarine defenses had matured. Convoy routing avoided areas where submarines might operate. Hunter-killer groups patrolled choke points. Aircraft covered vast areas. Breaking through such defenses required luck more than skill. K-10 human torpedoes represented a grim evolution of kamikaze philosophy applied to submarine warfare. K-10 were manned torpedoes, essentially suicide weapons, carried by submarines and launched against enemy ships. The pilot sat in a cramped cockpit, controlled the torpedo's course, and detonated the warhead on impact. Submarines carrying K-10s achieved some successes, sinking fleet oiler Mississinua in November 1944, but losses among K-10 operators were 100%. The tactic reflected desperation rather than sound military doctrine. Throwing away trained personnel in weapons that killed their operators, regardless of success or failure, was strategically bankrupt. Several Japanese submarines survived until war's end, surrendering in August 1945 after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announced Japan's capitulation. I-58, which had sunk heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis in July 1945 in the last major Japanese submarine success of the war, surrendered at sea. I-400, I-401, and I-14, giant submarines designed to carry aircraft, surrendered without seeing significant combat. American forces examined these vessels with interest, noting their size and capabilities, but concluded they represented technological dead ends. The submarines were too large, too complex, and too expensive for their limited utility. Most captured Japanese submarines were scuttled rather than preserved. For surviving Japanese submarine commanders, the post-war years brought reflection on what had gone wrong. Some wrote memoirs analyzing Japanese tactical and strategic failures. They noted the Navy's fixation on fleet actions at the expense of commerce warfare. They criticized inadequate anti-submarine training and equipment. They acknowledged American technological superiority in radar, sonar, and weapons. But mostly, they remembered the numerical disparity. The endless stream of American ships, aircraft, and supplies overwhelmed Japanese forces regardless of courage or tactical skill. One commander wrote that counting American carriers felt like counting stars, a futile attempt to quantify the infinite. The escort carrier program ended with the war's conclusion. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard closed. The Casablanca-class carriers, built for wartime emergencies, were not designed for long service lives. Many were decommissioned within months of Japan's surrender. Some were scrapped immediately. Others entered reserve fleets where they sat for years before eventual scrapping. A few received conversions for specialized roles, aircraft transports, escort helicopter carriers, or training vessels. By 1960, nearly all escort carriers had been removed from active service. Not one Casablanca-class carrier survives today as a museum ship, though their contribution to victory was immense. The lessons learned from escort carrier operations influenced post-war naval aviation development. The concept of small, numerous carriers supporting larger fleet carriers persisted in American naval planning. During the Cold War, the Navy operated several classes of smaller carriers: the Commencement Bay class, modified Essex-class carriers, and eventually purpose-built anti-submarine carriers. The strategic flexibility that escort carriers provided during World War II demonstrated that not every mission required a supercarrier. This philosophy influenced carrier construction programs for decades. For Japanese submariners who survived, the memories remained painful. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, knowing they lived while comrades died. Some wrote histories and memoirs, attempting to ensure younger generations understood what had happened and why. They emphasized that individual courage could not compensate for industrial weakness. They noted that Japan's military leadership had failed to understand the type of war they were fighting. World War II was not a war of samurai spirit against colonial decadence. It was a war of factories, resources, and industrial capacity. Japan had challenged a nation that outproduced it by orders of magnitude. The outcome was never truly in doubt once America mobilized its full industrial potential. The submarine veterans also remembered specific moments that crystallized their understanding of defeat. For many, seeing American escort carriers in overwhelming numbers represented that moment. 8 carriers where 2 should be. 20 carriers supporting an invasion. Carriers everywhere, providing air cover, hunting submarines, transporting aircraft, screening convoys. The numbers proved impossible to overcome. No amount of skill or bravery mattered when the enemy deployed 10 ships for everyone Japan could field. That mathematical reality defined the Pacific War's final years. Production won. Industry won. The side with more factories, more resources, and more people won. Everything else was commentary. The image remains vivid decades later. A submarine commander standing on a conning tower, salt spray on his face, counting enemy carriers until the count becomes meaningless. 8, 10, 20. The numbers blur into overwhelming certainty. His nation cannot win. The realization is not dramatic. There are no explosions, no dying words, no cinematic moments, just quiet recognition that all the training, all the sacrifice, all the devotion to duty cannot change mathematical reality. When one side builds 50 carriers in 15 months and the other struggles to maintain 4, the outcome is determined by production schedules rather than battles. World War II demonstrated that industrial capacity could be a more decisive weapon than courage. Japanese submariners possessed courage. They faced depth charges, aircraft, and overwhelming odds with discipline and determination. But courage could not sink escort carriers they could not reach. Skill could not overcome radar they could not detect. Spirit could not compensate for fuel they did not have, torpedoes they could not reload, and bases that were being overrun. The war became a contest between factory output and strategic resources, and Japan lost that contest decisively. The escort carriers represented a uniquely American solution to naval warfare. They were not elegant, they were not impressive compared to fleet carriers. They were slow, cramped, and vulnerable, but they were adequate, and they existed in numbers that overwhelmed opposition through sheer mass. That pragmatic approach to military production reflected American strengths. The United States could not match Japanese tactical excellence at the war's start, but it could outbuild any opponent. Henry Kaiser's shipyards turned naval construction into assembly line manufacturing. The resulting escort carriers were good enough to accomplish their missions and cheap enough to build in overwhelming quantities. For the men who fought the submarine war, on both sides, the memories carried weight that numbers could not fully capture. USS England's crew sank 6 submarines in 12 days, a record that will likely never be equaled. But they understood those 6 submarines held 350 men who drowned or suffocated in darkness. Victory came at the cost of lives, theirs and the enemy's. The strategic necessity of submarine warfare did not erase its human cost. War is mathematics and statistics, production numbers, and casualty figures, but it is also individual human beings making choices that lead to death or survival. Those choices, multiplied across millions of participants, determined outcomes. The Pacific War ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945. The submarine war ended months earlier when Japan's submarine force ceased to be an effective fighting force. The escort carriers that had hunted submarines so effectively were retired, scrapped, or converted to other uses. The men who served on them returned to civilian life. The industrial mobilization that had produced them wound down, but the lesson remained. Modern war is total war. It involves entire nations, entire economies, entire populations. Victory comes not from single battles, but from sustained industrial output, technological innovation, and strategic resource allocation. The side that masters those elements, that turns its economy into a weapon as potent as its military, that side wins wars. Everything else is tactics.